Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, sometimes stuff happens that's just awful in the news, and it's really hard to bring this uniquely Christian perspective to bear on it. But I think there are some things that we can say today as we start the show about the top news item of the week, which was the massive, unbelievable explosion that happened in Beirut, Lebanon earlier this week and killed so far 135 people, a bunch more missing, 5,000 people injured. The video of this thing was just apocalyptic. I couldn't believe it. It was like something out of a movie. And then we got it from a couple different angles. And then apparently the story is now that it was caused by a large Russian vessel that had been docked there in the harbor since 2013 or something like that. And it was carrying ammonium nitrate, which is an ingredient in fertilizer, massive, massive amounts of this stuff. We don't know what set it off, but that's what caused this damage and devastation and tragic loss of life.
Look, I saw a Facebook meme earlier this week. It said, "Lord, please bring us some precedented events, as opposed to the unprecedented that's been so far in 2020." And I kind of felt that way watching this. This was, it was something. This week was also the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. During
Many
World War
visually
II.
compared it to that.
Well, it looked like it. I mean, that secondary explosion was just incredible. We do know too that there were some Christian churches there on the ground that were directly impacted. We know that some were, miraculously spared. It kind of reminded me already of 9/11, where that church very close to the place where the buildings fell. That church, I'm trying to remember the name of the church. I can't off the top of my head, but a historic church connected with Alexander Hamilton, I believe. But anyway, that was a church that survived, strangely enough. We're going to hear those sorts of stories out of this. But it's just this, it's just awful. And sometimes you just have to say that. But even in our saying of this, it does reflect something that's true about the world that the Christian worldview explains, which is that we recognize evil and suffering as evil and suffering. Mm-hmm. At least in general, there's a universal kind of agreed upon shock and awe and kind of a horrific response to certain things like this. And if the universe is an accident, then the morality that we perceive itself is nothing but kind of categories made up. That the idea that we have some sort of impulse for empathy really is hard to explain in any kind of survival of the fittest framework. The fact that the entire world looks at this and tries to explain such an act of devastating evil, as opposed to just accepting that this is the way things are, I think does tell us something about the Christian worldview, or tells us something about reality that the Christian worldview itself can explain.
Well, it's true whether we're talking about natural evils, accidents like this apparently is, or acts of intentional evil like terrorist attacks. You mentioned 9/11. And we can talk about other human-caused disasters like the bombing of Hiroshima, these unprecedented use of force that we're marking now the anniversary of. These all, we look at them and we see something wrong there, whether it's a moral fault or a natural evil, a fault in our stars, so to speak. Something's not right. We're not happy with the way the world is, and we want it to be different. And I think it goes much deeper than self-interest. It's not just that we're afraid for our own lives. We want to make sure something like this doesn't happen. I mean, this sort of thing is not that common in the developed world. It's certainly not in the United States. I mean, there are accidents like this. The 3 Mile Island, I guess, would be the one that comes to mind. It's much more common in communist countries, things like Chernobyl. But we look at it and we say, now this is not right. And we have deep compassion. We're moved for those who are affected by disasters like this. And that says something about us. I think it's good that says something about us. And we care not just about the people who are like us, the Christians, those who the church is affected, although we should be uniquely concerned for our brothers and sisters, but for all those in the way of this sort of horrific disaster. We should be moved with compassion. It says a lot about us, and it should move us to prayer as well as to help. I wanted to mention, John, that I'm sure there are a number of Christian charities that are going to be pouring into that area after this disaster to help those who are left homeless, to help those who are injured, the families who are bereaved, and then of course there's a search and rescue effort still active going on right now as we speak.
Well, and it's kind of devastation that is going to be going on for a while. And I think too, it's important to remember that there's a vibrant, active Christian church on the ground now in Lebanon. This is not a place where, there's not a strong Christian presence. And certainly the typical players, Samaritan's Purse, Convoy of Hope, we'll see, these players run into the brokenness, which is what Christians often do. It's something we should, as Mr. Rogers liked to say, look for the helpers. Yeah. There will be helpers, but there will also be an opportunity here for the Christians on the ground. And, if we're thinking about how to pray, and certainly we can pray for the wounded, but we know that this is an opportunity that God is presenting his church with on the ground there. Our brothers and sisters, part of the faithful cloud of witnesses throughout history. And they're not the first ones to find themselves called to be the hands and feet of Christ in remarkably difficult circumstances. And they need our prayers. Because we also know too that, look, there are ideological divides that we face in America. When there's a disaster like this, you have Christians helping atheists, conservatives helping progressives, and vice versa, and all the way around. And the same thing is true there. But there's some acute, divides there religiously and politically. And so the opportunity is great. The risk is great. And man, Lord have mercy. I mean, I'm with you. The video of that explosion, and there's even been some, videos added. There was a bride. I don't know if you saw this, but this was stunning. A bride taking wedding photos. And when this explosion happened, and the sheer terror, and you just think, man, that's just not something that people should go through, particularly on what for her was supposed to be a happy day. And it should break our hearts. And the fact that it does break our hearts does say something about who we are.
Well, there's another heartbreaking incident that happened earlier this year, and that has really gripped our nation since it happened. And we've just learned a little bit more about it. Speaking of evil, speaking of things that move us here, the George Floyd killing was the thing that sparked the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests, both, peaceful, and then the riots around the country and city after city that destroyed property, and it ultimately ended up killing some people. Well, the leaked body cam footage from one of the officers involved in that altercation back earlier this year shows the initial 8 minutes or so of the confrontation and the arrest. And we all know the details. George Floyd, who's Black, died after former officer Derek Chauvin, who was an officer at the time, knelt on his neck for nearly 8 minutes as he pleaded that he couldn't breathe. Well, this newly released footage shows George Floyd's extreme agitation. Possibly I've heard a lot of speculation that it was brought on by cocaine and fentanyl, which were found in his system during the autopsy. But during the arrest, he repeatedly refused to comply with instructions or to get into the SUV, the police SUV there, and was showing just an immense amount of agitation and panic that he clearly wasn't in his right mind at the time. And even some of the bystanders there were telling him, "Hey, just get in the car. Why are you freaking out like this?" So writing at the American Conservative, Rod Dreher, he kind of walks back his initial take on this, and he says that this new evidence will probably lead to the acquittal of both officers involved, and because it might undermine the charges of intentional murder. It doesn't look like there was an intentional murder that took place here. Now, he does say that it's probably the case that there was excessive force, that the officer acted wrongly. But this really complicates the overall narrative of what happened in the George Floyd killing, and whether or not it was murder, and whether or not the kind of outrage we saw around the country specifically about this was warranted. So I think we need to have that complicated conversation, because we have commented on it here on the program before.
This is going to get messy in two ways. Number one is additional footage always adds additional context, and we've seen this over and over and over again. And at the same time, there's a difference between saying that Officer Chauvin had a a track record of bad behavior as a police officer, and he was known for that sort of thing. The police department in Minnesota had a history of kind of brutality and militarization that it had not fully dealt with.
Right.
Therefore, Officer Chauvin was not fully dealt with, which put him into this position, and that he, in this position, did something wrong. He certainly was excessive. He was excessive, certainly at the end. And you can hear the bystanders, even at the earlier footage that we received, basically saying, look, he's not responding. Get off him. Call 911. And it takes minutes for that response to happen when it shouldn't. And using a questionable method, and so on. But that's not the same thing as essentially saying, I'm going to, arrest you for a $20 fraudulent bill, put you on the ground in a way that could necessarily lead to the end of your life, which is the story that seemed to be nearly conclusive. And again, you look at it again, even the original footage, and you look at this footage now, the officer's behavior is still absolutely wrong. But the acquittal that I think Rod is talking about is not the acquittal of everything that Officer Chauvin has done, but it is this acquittal on this idea of intentional murder. Like he set out to kill this guy, and that's exactly what happened. And he didn't have any regard whatsoever for George Floyd's life. The key part of this video, by the way, is just what you said, that he's clearly not in his right mind.
Yeah.
So the question has got to be, though, this is not, I mean, we can still agree, this is not okay. Something went dramatically wrong here. George Floyd should not be dead. And Officer Chauvin should not have behaved that way. Is not fully justified. And so we can't, immediately jump to our tribalistic corners and say, well, see, police officers are always right. And quote unquote, perps are always wrong. I mean, that's just, that's not going to help. We do have a problem with the militarization of police. We do need to reimagine what community justice looks like. We do need to not expect officers to do jobs that they're not trained to do, like social work and psychology. I mean, there's so many parts of this. And yet, we also need to understand how difficult this job is that these police officers do day in and day out. And the vast majority of them are remarkable individuals who are courageous and put their lives on the line and do it well. This is going to be one of those things, Shane. This is going to fall, and I think we always probably knew this, but now we know it at a new level. This isn't going to be kind of, this makes perfect sense. This is clearly what went wrong and how we can fix it all. There's not going to be a way around this. There's not going to be a simplifying of, dealing with this.
And no pun intended, but it's not as black and white as we had originally thought.
It's not. But you know what? If Rod is right and the trial ends up where he suggests, and I don't know that Rod is right on this, and I don't know that there's not more evidence that's going to come out. And
who knows at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's good luck predicting the future in 2020. But I think what we're going to find is that the predisposed answers that people started with is what the vast majority is what they're going to end with.
Right.
And they're going to look at the same footage, and they're going to come up with the completely different interpretations. And it's because of worldview. This is why we talk about worldview and the need for us to ground our worldview, not into one side or the other of the culture war or political parties, but ultimately in Scripture. It doesn't mean we won't agree with one side more than another of the various divides in America. But we've got to ground it in the right place, or we're not going to be able to avoid being deceived.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, there was something you and I were discussing just before the show began here, just before we started recording, about the back to school rush that's happening and how there's a lot of chaos in parents' minds and educators' minds about what exactly it's going to look like and how exactly we're going to pull this off. And we've talked recently a lot on Breakpoint and on this program about innovation in education, the new ideas that are being born, not just as a result of this pandemic, but also because people are looking for an alternative. They're trying to figure out how best to customize their education and do what's best for their kids. So there's a new initiative that I think you want to talk about here that we've actually got a Breakpoint coming out shortly about.
Yeah, well, look, let me just start by saying you and I have pretty cushy jobs, right? Like we get to talk about all the chaos of our culture, but we don't have to meet any deadlines. We don't have to replan. I mean, look, we had to take all our spring, big event online, and it was incredible and it was amazing, and God really blessed it. But good heavens, I mean, we're talking about education. A group of educators in the air had to rebuild the plane last spring, moving from
It's a good
in-person
metaphor.
instruction to it's true, and online to online, and then also had to get kids from wherever they were to graduation and wherever they were to finishing the course of study, had to communicate that. And now trying to plan for this year. What on earth does that even look like? I mean, how many times have the rules changed? I mean, my favorite was the governor of North Carolina a couple of weeks ago coming out with an announcement that he didn't have an announcement, about what they were
Did he
going to
really do
do.
that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And because he
So
had, in some sense he had to, another sense but he changed his mind twice since then, as did so many of the other schools. And then we've got stories of schools now back in that are changing their minds midstream and all kinds of things. And then you've got to communicate with parents. Look, we've talked about how hard it's been for pastors to meet regulations and reopen and keep everybody happy. Can you imagine doing that with parents? And then the chaos that this is going to cause for employment. With parents who need to go to work and count on this time when their kids can go to school. And if their kids can't, and we say all that, Shane, and then a couple weeks ago, we talked specifically about how this could be an opportunity for Christian education. And that if you ask me if I'm pessimistic or optimistic about education, I think that there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of courageous Christians that are still in the world of public education. I always get in trouble when I say that. But there are heads of schools, there are teachers that follow Jesus and that are living out a mission field where God has placed them. But the system itself is deeply troubled. And so it's hard to be optimistic when it comes to that. But I see a remarkable amount of educational innovation in new schools. And I think we're going to see parents more and more dipping their toe in some of these waters, whether it's charter schools or whether it's kind of innovative online hybrid models, or whether it's hybrid model, by the way, is the great term for education because it just means whatever I make up. But that's in and of itself a pretty cool innovation because, you're looking at schooling for your kids. We're in the middle, of schooling with our kids, and you can make a whole lot of things up in Colorado. There's a good bit of freedom to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and mix it all together. And it actually ends up being a pretty good education. So we just spent a lot of time this spring, Shane, caring about these teachers that are facing a remarkable amount of upheaval and change. And also realizing that Christian education, whether we're talking about homeschool families or we're talking about Christian schools or classical Christian schools or, religiously based charter schools or religiously influenced charter schools, I should say, their job is different because the mission there is not to educate for employment, but to educate for eternity. I think some people think Christian education is, we'll do the same thing, but have more rules and maybe a chapel service. I used to joke like education with long skirts and short hair.
Yeah, uniforms, exactly. That's the main difference. And
Yeah.
social distancing when there's not a virus around.
Yeah, which Christian schools should embrace because we always had social distancing, with girls. You couldn't be
Right.
within. We had the sunlight rule and the 6-inch rule and
The Holy Spirit rule.
the whole leave room for the Holy Spirit. That was too vague at my school. They were way more
How
specific.
big is he? We're not sure.
But look, but that's never actually been what Christian education is about. Christian education, T.S. Eliot said, it's not about making men and women pious. It's training them to think in Christian categories. In other words, it's a fundamentally way of seeing life in the world. And that task hasn't changed. So everyone who's involved in education has a complicated time. Christian education itself is even more complicated because that mission, which in and of itself is hard, hasn't changed. So listen, what we've done is partnered with two wonderful educational leaders, the Association of Christian Schools International, which is the accrediting umbrella arm for thousands of Christian schools around the country and around the world, and the International Alliance of Christian Education, which is a CATA seminary, actually alliance of educational leaders, schools, institutions, networks, committed to the same vision around Christian education. And we've produced a professional development program. You know, if whatever job you're in, you need professional development, and every headmaster knows that teachers need ongoing professional development, mainly because the culture changes. And so the program we've put together is completely free. It's online. It's set up so that entire schools that are looking for teacher in service, 2 or 3 days that they can walk their schools in, which I've spoken at hundreds of those. And now this is something that creates a really good content that you can discuss over as a faculty and staff. We even got a specific module for worldview teaching at the elementary level, which is something that's very difficult for many elementary teachers to apply. And our two instructors there, Elizabeth Urbanowicz and Dr. Kathy Cook, talk about what that looks like at the elementary level. And we want to invite schools and educators, home educators, just to use this. What does it mean to teach worldviewishly in this cultural moment? And we go from kind of introductory modules on worldview, the idea of image of God as grounding Christian education, certainly the cultural flashpoints of sex and race and gender and technology, spiritual formation. That's a huge one, because you can help kids think the right things, but that doesn't mean they'll live the right things. And putting the heart and the head together, as Lewis talked about in Men Without Chest, what does that look like? And then, of course, resources for elementary educators. We'll link to it. Come to breakpoint.org. We'll link to it on the show notes. You can also go to educators.colsoncenter.org. That's educators.colsoncenter.org. Lots of resources come together with this content. And again, you can do it as a group. You can do it as an entire faculty and staff. You can do it as an individual. It's a wonderful 5-module professional development program. And I know ACSI, for example, is giving a remarkable amount of continuing education units, which schools need for accreditation for completing this.
We'll link to this resource in the show notes for Breakpoint this week at breakpoint.org. Come and check that out, folks. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, we have to hit the transgender issue on this episode. I know that we try as hard as we can to stay away from it, but it's just such a cultural hot topic right now. And there are 2 major stories this week that are deeply pertinent to the stuff we've talked about surrounding gender and sexual identity. The first is actually a dramatic reversal of a 2019 study which claimed that so-called gender transition surgery, both surgery and chemical treatment, by the way, may improve the long-term mental health of recipients. Well, the authors of that study have actually issued a correction, which is more like a retraction, nearly a year after their initial publication. They said that they found no advantage to the mental health of those who received gender transition surgery a year or more after the surgery had actually taken place. And Ryan Anderson, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a good friend of the Colson Center, wrote on Monday that the correction was not only needed, he said, the bottom line is the largest data set on sex reassignment procedures, both hormonal and surgical, reveals that such procedures don't bring the promised mental health benefits. In other words, we are, in this country, we are mutilating and altering people's bodies for no discernible or provable reason, no benefit. That's a shocking revelation.
No, it is. And let's also just keep in mind too, that the mental health, the rate of mental health problems for that community,
Yeah.
including suicide rates and all kinds of
I
different
think it's
things.
something like 6 times the general population.
Yeah. So in other words, we're not just talking about a flat line here. We're talking about a population that needs our help. If we really care about them, if we really care about dignity, then we're not going to let kind of ideological, predeterminations, in our pre-commitment, and this is what really where it is, our pre-commitment that the ultimate human good is sexual autonomy, like that is the summum bonum about human beings and who we are about. If we don't start there and we actually care about people, we're going to change completely how we, talk about this. And of course, we also need to keep in mind as well that, at least part of the group that we're talking about here are kids. And every chapter of the sexual revolution has victimized children.
Right.
And so now we're encouraging children in delusions. We're encouraging, even changing language. You use the word gender transition surgery or sex reassignment. That's not even an okay thing to say anymore, Shane. You're supposed to call it sex or gender affirmation. In other words, we're gonna mutilate a body and put in order to create an illusion that it corresponds with some sort of inner knowledge or inner sense.
Right.
And that's affirming what is actually true.
I think the best analogy is still the anorexia thing, that we've got, someone who says that, well, my body is a certain way, I'm fat, but you're not, you're actually starving yourself. And so the applying the transgender logic to this situation, we have to say that, well, you must affirm that person in their delusion, even though it doesn't correspond to their physical, medically discernible reality. You have to say, well, yes, you actually are fat, and I'm going to help you in your quest to eat less and starve yourself to death. That's not loving.
It's not loving. But even more than that, the other side advances this agenda on power, not on reason. And this is what's so troubling, is that this is a remarkable reversal of, again, the largest data set we have. And did you see anything about it anywhere else?
Nothing.
No.
Nothing except in Christian media.
Well, that's right. And at the same time, what did we hear? There was a group of women, 309 women, who signed a letter to the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, asking them to protect women's sports. So what the NCAA did is leaked their names and locations, not direct addresses, but here's the colleges they're at and the sports they play, to an organization called Outsports, which is led by someone who was essentially fired for not doing his job as part of NBC News, and has gone back and forth in terms of his own gender identity several times, who then publishes this list and what's called doxxing, which basically is, let's set these people up for public humiliation and public embarrassment. You're talking about college students, females. Didn't we just have an entire movement, Shane, called #MeToo? And wasn't a key part of that having to do with sports like U.S. gymnastics or campus life and all the fears of rape culture? In other words, abusing women, men using their positions to abuse and oppress and so on, mistreat women. Here you have Outsports essentially endangering the safety and well-being of 309 female athletes, and it was set up by the NCAA. This is horrific.
This is why you've said so often, we've both said so often on this program and others, that the LGBT movement is really a misnomer. I mean, it all gets sort of lumped together in that acronym, and that's the way people treat it. But not that we're saying, anything approving of the L, the G, the B. We've talked a lot about that, but the T is making a really fundamental and radical claim that actually is quite different from the claims that the others are making about themselves and about society. And it's an anti-feminist claim. If you're going by feminism anytime before, say I was in high school, it's and a lot of feminists have actually recognized this, and now they're tarred as TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. Because why is that, John? Why are they tarred? Because they believe that a man cannot declare himself a woman and automatically receive all the privileges, benefits, and distinctions that go with being a woman. So why do women's athletics exist? Why do women's sports exist? One very simple reason. So they won't have to compete against men, because men have physical advantages in certain key areas that would render it impossible for a woman to fairly compete on a track or in gymnastics or on a soccer field or what have you. And now we're reversing all that in the name of this ideology that says that a man can simply declare himself a woman and get onto the field or get onto the track or get into the gymnasium with women. That's not feminist. How is that a benefit to women? And now, not only are we doing that, John, not only are we trashing women's athletics careers, we're trashing women themselves, their public careers and characters, by doxing them. And doxing is a lot more than just public shaming. It's an implicit threat too. Here's who this person is, this minor in this case. who is, and no, that's not, well, okay, it could be minors at some point, but we're talking about collegiate athletes. So these are young women who were outing, giving their names to the public, and then telling the public where they are, giving them easy information to track these women down. I mean, that's terrifying. Of course, that's going to cow many people into silence, and that's exactly the purpose. But it's a despicable tactic, and there's nothing feminist about it.
No, and it violates all the things that we were trying to correct, 3 months ago with the hashtag Me Too movement, thing. But it reminds me of something we did. One of our "What Would You Say" videos about critical theory. Is critical theory practical? Is that and one of the points that we made in that is that this is behavior that would have been roundly and swiftly condemned if any other group participated in it, especially, for example, religious conservatives. It would be called hateful, it would be called harmful, we would be accused of doing damage, and so on. And this has to do with the whole idea of critical theory, in which individuals who are perceived or self-identify within groups that are oppressed groups have a level of moral authority. And they also have a level of, what do we want to call it? Immunity. Immunity of, in other words, the tactics that they use are justified by the oppression that they have now claimed and identified with. And this has always confused me a bit about the T part of the acronym, because the L and the G and the B, although I would disagree with it, at least try to do a little bit of scientific work to medically and philosophically and scientifically defend homosexual behavior and the choices, and talking about gay genes and all that sort of stuff, even if they all fell short. And there's also, of course, at least some stories that have to do with a level of oppression or long term or something like that. The T's have made no argument that has had any sort of scientific credence. It continues to be proven wrong across the board, and it continues to oppress others in the name of an oppressed group. And somehow the ability of the T movement to ride the coattails of the civil rights movement, not least of which, not to mention the L and the G and the B movement, is really something. And it just made me think, like, look, when's the emperor gonna be revealed to have no clothes? I will say that for Christians, this is what we should actually be confident of, is that this is a straw man. This whole thing is an empty suit. Like this is not something to fear. Don't be a jerk. Be as kind and loving as God commands you to be to every single image bearer. But you know what? Don't back down on this one. And the cultural pressure is great, and a whole lot of folks are backing down. But this one is just vacuous, and it can be responded to.
100% agree with you, John. Well, folks, we're out of time for today. Thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories and resources that we've mentioned today on the program, as well as a wealth of commentaries and podcasts and videos updated regularly to help you live out your Christian faith in every area of life. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.